Traditional Hawaiian Metaphors by Lilikala Kame'elehiva. If one is to follow Denning's example of constructing a model of indigenous divisions of space and time, then surely one must nanaike kumu, or look to the source, to the beginnings in the kumulipo, and ultimately to Hawaiian genealogies. The genealogies are the Hawaiian concept of time, and they order the space around us. Hawaiian genealogies are the histories of our people. Through them we learn of the exploits and identities of our ancestors, their great deeds and their follies, their loves and their accomplishments, and their errors and defeats. Even though the great genealogies are of the ali'i nui and not of the commoners, these ali'i nui are the collective ancestors, and their mo'olelo histories are histories of all Hawaiians too. It is Davida Malo, a Hawaiian scholar of the 1840s, who tells us commoners and chiefs were all descended from the same ancestors, Wakea and Papa. The Hawaiian historian of the 1860s, Samuel Kamakau, in his introduction to a genealogical discussion, agrees, in this chiefly genealogy are the ancestors of the chiefs and the general populace of Hawaii. Or as some old Hawaiian wit once proclaimed, anyone who doesn't know he is of the great chief, Umi, doesn't really know who his father is. The ancestors' deeds of courage inspire our own. Their thoughts and desires become the parameters of our ambitions. They are the models after which we Hawaiians have patterned our behavior. Genealogies are perceived by Hawaiians as an unbroken chain that links those alive today to the primeval life forces, to the mana, spiritual power, that first emerged with the beginning of the world. Genealogies anchor Hawaiians to our place in the universe and give us the comforting illusion of continued existence. The hundreds of generations recounted in Hawaiian genealogies were especially important to Hawaiians after Western contact, because by the 1870s, many people, especially foreigners, cruelly predicted the complete demise of the Hawaiian race as inevitable. Genealogies also brought Hawaiians psychological comfort in times of acute distress. The greatest distress began in 1778 upon contact with the Western world. For 100 years after the arrival of the first white explorer, Captain Cook, foreign diseases carried off the Hawaiian people. From Cook's low estimate in 1779 of a population of 400,000, compared with a modern estimate of 800,000, the Hawaiian population declined to 40,000 by the time of the overthrow of the Hawaiian government in 1893. The death toll from Cook's time onward was certainly far greater than those lives offered in sacrifice to the war god Ku. During these years, Hawaiians saw their society falling apart as their friends and loved ones died around them. By the 1870s, Hawaiian religion and politics had made a very definite shift to Western models wherein genealogy seemed irrelevant. Nonetheless, Hawaiians continued to cling to our great genealogical debates as if the lineages of the ali'i nui were proof that the race still existed as a great nation. In 1873, when Kalakaua and Emma vied for election as sovereign, one of the more important topics of debate was the purity of their lineages, with each side casting aspersions on the other. From the Western point of view, the real issue was who would make a better sovereign, with regard to the political views of the candidates. From the Hawaiian standpoint, it was genealogy that determined the quality of any proposed sovereign. Interest in genealogies was again revived after Queen Liliuokalani was overthrown in 1893 and Hawaiians cried out for sovereignty. Kamaka'ainana, the Commoner, a Hawaiian language newspaper, began publishing genealogies again in 1896. Many other Hawaiian language newspapers had done so from as early as 1834. The editor's rationale was, "It is said, the one who does not know the genealogy is a rustic from the back country, and the one who knows, he is a chief or a person of the court. In Europe, the man who does not know the history and lacks the genealogy of his birthplace and other enlightened lands is a recognizable fool. Therefore, will the new generation of Hawaii'nei be changed to a class of backward and ignorant people? In order that this should not occur, quickly seek to understand the true history and genealogy of Hawaii." The editors of Kamaka'ainana confirmed what most Western historians writing about Hawaii have ignored or failed to comprehend. Hawaiian genealogies are the history of Hawaiian people. Ali'i Nui are not merely individuals born into a ruling class. They are the totality of their genealogy, which is comprised of the character of their ancestors. This is the sum total of their identity. From the Hawaiian view, it is pointless to discuss the actions of any character in Hawaiian history without a careful examination of his or her genealogy. It would be tantamount to writing a history of England without presenting the names of the monarchs and their cohorts. Without their identities, the account would be unintelligible. Ancestral identity is revealed in the names that Hawaiians carry, for the names of our ancestors continue as our names also. They belong to us alone, and should someone outside of the family use our names, it would be a theft of our mana. Names of the Ali'i Nui are repeated for successive generations to enhance and share the honor of the original ancestor. In this process, the name collects its own mana and endows the successor who carries it. It is said that the name molds the character of the child. So the great Maui chiefess Ka'ahumanu was named for her maternal uncle Kahekili Nui Ahumanu, the great thundering bird feathers, who, as a warlike mo'i of Maui in the 1790s, had gathered under his control all the islands from Maui to Ni'ihau. Because of her name, Ka'ahumanu carried the recollection of her uncle's mana from her very birth. The accomplishments of her lifetime were attributed to the mana of her name and further enhanced Kahekili's lineage, adding to the collective identity. The editors of the newspaper Kamaka'ainana had a political purpose for publishing genealogies, for genealogies are a means of glorifying one's ancestors and one's past. If the ancestors are glorious, so too are the descendants, especially when compared to the Americans who had overthrown the queen. Since the lineages of Hawaiian chiefs could be traced back for 900 generations and more, American genealogies were practically non-existent, or at least very shallow by comparison. If genealogies could act as psychological reinforcement, they were just what Kalahui Hawaii, the Hawaiian nation, needed when the kingdom was lost. In addition, genealogies were the list from which new Ali'i Nui could be found, and new leadership was desperately needed at that time. All native scholars have agreed that Ali'i are chiefs because they know their genealogies. Malo supposes that as all people have descended from the Ali'i, Maka'ainana must be those descendants who wandered off into the back country and were forgotten by the other Ali'i. Wandering into the back country is synonymous with acting like a kua'aina, back country or country bumpkin. and not like an ali'i. Perhaps the answer to the mystery of Maka'ainana origins lies in the refusal of some ali'i to act like chiefs by ignoring religious doctrine, disregarding their kapu, or forming lasting relationships with Maka'ainana women, leading to their subsequent banishment from the Royal Lineage Club. In any case, genealogies are more than mo'oku auhau, or lists of who begot whom. They are also a mnemonic device by which the mo'olelo, or the exploits of the ali'i, are recalled. As the lists of names are chanted, the adventures of each ali'i are remembered, and these, in turn, form the body of tradition by which their descendants pattern their chiefly behavior. In times past, when a problem arose, the ali'i, usually in council, would send for a kaka'olelo, an antiquarian and genealogist, who would consider the issue and recount all the pertinent mo'olelo. Then the mo'i would know which decision had brought his ancestors' success. This would be the path to follow. It is interesting to note that in Hawaiian, the past is referred to as kava mamua, or the time in front or before, whereas the future, when thought of at all, is kava mahope, or the time which comes after or behind. It is as if the Hawaiian stands firmly in the present, with his back to the future and his eyes fixed upon the past, seeking historical answers for present-day dilemmas. Such an orientation is to the Hawaiian an eminently practical one, for the future is always unknown, whereas the past is rich in glory and knowledge. It also bestows upon us a natural propensity for the study of history. Wakea and Papa, the beginning of Hawaiian time. One of the more fundamental patterns for ali'i nui behavior was established in the epic tradition of Wakea and Papa, the Sky Father and Earth Mother, who by the Opu Kahunua lineage were half-brother and half-sister. These two were said to be the parents of islands Hawaii and Maui, and later Kauai, Ni'ihau, Lehua, and Ka'ula, as well as the ancestors of Kalahui, Hawaii. According to tradition, their first human offspring was a daughter, Ho'ohoku Kalani, to generate stars in the sky, who matured into a great beauty. A desire for his daughter welled up in Wakea, but he hoped to gratify his desire without his sister and wahine, woman or wife, knowing of it. It is the kahuna or priest who provided Wakea with a religious solution. This solution has come to be known as the Aikapu, sacred eating. The Aikapu is a religion in which males and females are separated in the act of eating, males being la'a or sacred, and females haumia or defiling by virtue of menstruation. Since in this context, eating is for men a religious ceremony or sacrifice to the male akua lono, it must be done apart from anything defiling, especially women. Female mana, however, was only haumia to the male akua and not to the female akua, whom women worshipped freely. Thus, men must prepare the food in separate ovens, one for the men, another for the women, and must build separate eating houses for each. Under Aikapu, certain foods, because of their male symbolism, also are forbidden to women, including pig, coconuts, bananas, and some red fish. The kahuna suggested that the new Aikapu religion should also require that 4 nights of each lunar month be set aside for special worship of the 4 major male akua, Ku, Lono, Kane, and Kanaloa. On these nights it was kapu for men to sleep with their wahine. Moreover, they should be at the heiau temple services on these nights. When Papa was informed of the priest's new regulations, tradition tells us she accepted them without question. On one of these kapu nights, Wakea was able to be alone with his daughter, Ho'ohokukalani, and he seduced her. Being a faithful daughter, Ho'ohokukalani told her mother what had occurred. After a dreadful row, Papa left Wakea in anger and took other lovers. Although they were eventually reconciled and she would bear him other islands. The first child of Wakea and Ho'ohokukalani was an unformed fetus born prematurely. They named him Haloanaka, quivering long stalk. They buried Haloanaka in the earth, and from that spot grew the first kalo plant. The second child, named Haloa in honor of his elder brother, was the first Hawaiian ali'i and became the ancestor of all the Hawaiian people. Thus the kalo plant, which was the main staple of the people of old, is also the elder brother of the Hawaiian race, and as such deserves great respect. What then are the lessons or historical metaphors that arise from the mo'olelo of Wakea? The first lesson is of man's familial relationship to the land, that is, to the islands of Hawaii and Maui, and to the kalo Haloanaka, who are the elder siblings of the Hawaiian chiefs and people. See Figure 1. This relationship is reflected in the Hawaiian tradition of Mālama'aina, caring for the land. The second lesson of Aikapu is separation of the sacred male element from the dangerous female, thus creating order in the world. The Kahuna Nui's suggestion of Aikapu also allows the chief to fulfill his desires. The third and final lesson revolves around the mana divine power that emanates from Ni'opi'o mating, chiefly incest. These are the three traditional patterns from which all of Hawaiian society flows and the metaphor around which it is organized. Mālama'aina, caring for the land. In traditional Hawaiian society, as in the rest of Polynesia, it is the duty of younger siblings and junior lineages to love, honor, and serve their elders. This is the pattern that defines the Hawaiian relationship to the Aina and the kalo that together feed Kalahui Hawaii. Thus, the modern concepts of Oloha'aina, or love of the land, and Mālama'aina, or serving and caring for the land, stem from the traditional motto established at the time of Wakea. The Hawaiian does not desire to conquer his elder female sibling, the Aina, but to take care of her, to cultivate her properly, and to make her beautiful with neat gardens and careful husbandry. Moreover, throughout Polynesia, it is the reciprocal duty of the elder siblings to hanai, feed, the younger ones, as well as to love and ho'omalu, protect them. The relationship is thereby further defined. It is the Aina, the kalo, and the ali'i who are to feed, clothe, and shelter their younger brothers and sisters, the Hawaiian people. So long as younger Hawaiians love, serve, and honor their elders, the elders will continue to do the same for them, as well as to provide for all their physical needs. Clearly, by this equation, it is the duty of Hawaiians to Mālama'aina, and as a result of this proper behavior, the Aina will Mālama Hawaiians. In Hawaiian, this perfect harmony is known as pono, which is often translated in English as righteous, but actually denotes a universe in perfect harmony. How did Hawaiians Mālama'aina? In the Hawaiian way of thinking, all directives in society emanate from the Akua, who on earth are represented by the ali'i nui, those gods visible to humans. The role of ali'i nui as mediators between the divine and human was to placate and manipulate those more dangerous and unseen Akua, whose powers regulated the earth and all the awesome forces of nature. In Polynesia, proximity to the Akua could mean death, and it was the duty of the ali'i nui to ho'omalu the maka'ainana from unnecessary death. From this standpoint, Ali'i Nui were the protectors of the Maka'ainana, sheltering them from terrible unseen forces. Should an Ali'i Nui neglect proper ritual and pious behavior, surely a famine or calamity would ensue. Should a famine arise, the Ali'i Nui was held at fault and deposed. Alternatively, should an Ali'i Nui be stingy and cruel to the commoners, the cultivators of the Aina, he or she would cease to be pono, lose favor with the Akua, and be struck down, usually by the people. Thus, the Ali'i Nui had to juggle their responsibilities to keep the cosmos in order, to protect themselves, and to maintain pono for their people. Ali'i Nui lived by those patterns proven trustworthy by their ancestors, the Akua. A reciprocal relationship was maintained. The Ali'i Nui kept the Aina fertile and the Akua appeased. The Maka'ainana fed and clothed the Ali'i Nui. The Ali'i Nui determined the correct uses of the Aina. The Pono, or righteous Ali'i Nui, was one who established order upon the Aina so that it might be more productive. A good example is Ma'ilikukahi, a mo'i of Oahu, elected by the Council of Chiefs, perhaps in the 14th century. His name became famous because he caused the island to be thoroughly surveyed and the boundaries between different divisions and lands to be definitely and permanently marked out, thus obviating future disputes between neighboring chiefs and landholders. The reign of Ma'ili Kukahi was renowned for peace, abundance of food, care for the Maka'ainana, and favorable increase in population. The key to his fame, no doubt, was organization of the Aina and its productivity. At about the same time on Maui, under the mo'i ka ka'alaneo, touched by the clear, serene heavens, a kahuna named Kalei Ka'ohi'a, carver of the sacred Ohi'a log, is said to have similarly divided or carved the Aina, Kalei Aina, into districts, sub-districts, and smaller divisions appointing to each level an ali'i or konohiki as supervisor. On Hawaii Island, several generations later, the mo'i Umialiloa implemented a similar system for the benefit of his people. On each island, as the population increased, central control was required to ensure plentiful food production. Control and direction was the business of the Ali'i Nui. In the Hawaiian system, each island or mokupuni was divided into large sections, or moku o loko, islands within, often known simply as moku. According to Malo, the moku were further divided into okana or kalana districts. E.S.C. Handy, an American anthropologist who had studied Hawaii in the 1930s, disagreed with Malo, citing historical evidence of missionary land surveyors from the 1840s. Evidently, by that time, okana and moku were interchangeable terms and described large districts such as Kona, Kohala, and Hamakua on Hawaii Island. Handy also cited examples where the term kalana was used interchangeably with okana, and also a sub-district of an okana. Perhaps these issues were merely a matter of difference in dialect or simple variation from one island to another. On Oahu, the term for district was kalana, and the island had been divided into 6 kalana since ancient times. The Oahu kalana were Kona, Ewa, Waianae, Wailua, Ko'olauloa, and Ko'olaupoko. What is known is that each district, whether called moku, okana, or kalana, was comprised of many ahupua'a. The ahupua'a were usually wedge-shaped sections of land that followed natural geographical boundaries such as ridge lines and rivers, and ran from mountain to sea. A valley bounded by ridges on 2 or 3 sides and by the sea on the 4th would be a natural ahupua'a. The word ahupua'a means pig altar, and it was named for the stone altars with pig head carvings that marked the boundaries of each ahupua'a. Ideally, an ahupua'a would include within its borders all the materials required for sustenance: timber, thatching, and rope from the mountains, various crops from the uplands, kalo from the lowlands, and fish from the sea. All members of the society shared access to these life-giving necessities. The ahupua'a were further divided into smaller sections called ili or ili aina, which varied in size and number from one ahupua'a to the next. For instance, the ahupua'a Waimanalo or Oahu had no ili, while other ahupua'a may have contained 30 or 40. Besides the ili ahupua'a, there was the ili kupono, the difference being that the former ili gave tribute to the ali'i of the ahupua'a, while the latter ili was independent of the ahupua'a and paid its tribute directly to the mo'i. An ili was not always a single piece. When it was comprised of several separate areas, it was referred to as a lele, to jump. According to Malo, ili aina were subdivided into pieces called mo'oaina, a strip of land, and those into smaller pieces called pauku'aina, joints of land, and the pauku'aina into patches or farms called kihapai. Below these came the ko'ele, the hakuone, and the kuakua. The ko'ele and hakuone were portions of aina cultivated for the ali'i and konohiki of the ahupua'a respectively. The kuakua was a broad embankment between lo'i, patches of wetland kalo, which was also kept well cultivated. Malo continues for several pages with further descriptions of precise aina terminologies as well as of the ali'i hierarchies that ensured maximum cultivation of the aina at each level of designation. In addition to overseeing the aina, the ali'i were also responsible for the establishment and upkeep of the extensive ovai irrigation systems, which were crucial to the production of wetland kalo. Wetland kalo fields, or lo'i, produce 10 to 15 times more kalo per acre than dryland kalo farms, thereby ensuring efficient support of a large population. The sophistication of the Hawaiian irrigation system was such that adverse environmental impact was kept to a bare minimum, whereas the water was diverted from the stream into successive lo'i and then returned to the stream again. There was little or no pollution. The system, however, required a high level of maintenance and vigilance on the part of the ali'i. It is not pertinent to discuss here the intricacies of Hawaiian methods of cultivation and aina designation, which has already been done so well by Handy, Chinen, and Kelly. Rather, it would be more useful to examine the respective roles of the ali'i nui, konohiki, and maka'inana, for it was this relationship that was most affected by the 1848 mahele. The complexity of the Hawaiian agricultural system is reflected in the naming of each aina parcel, lo'i, and fish pond, with personal names as well as definitive terms. Furthermore, all of these names and terms were known, understood, and accounted for by all of the ali'i, which is no small feat in a pre-literate society. In traditional Hawaii, memorization and a keen mind were invaluable tools. It is not surprising, therefore, that an equally complex system of konohiki, land stewards, arose to administer the aina, while the people who worked the aina were maka'inana, the konohiki, who directed their work, were ali'i of various degrees of lineage. The konohiki were usually of Koko Ali'i, or lesser rank, belonging in some fashion to the lineages of the Ali'i Aimoku, or Ali'i Nui, who ruled the large districts. At each level of Aina designation, there was a corresponding konohiki responsible for collecting tribute and for directing the day-to-day activities of cultivation and fishing. Collection of tribute by the Ali'i centered around the Makahiki festival, celebrated in honor of the fertility god Lono. Lono is said to have been an akua from Kahiki, who visited Hawaii each year bringing wondrous gifts for the people. His return was signaled by the rise of the Makali'i constellation, Pleiades, in the sky after sunset. This would occur in October or November, and the Makahiki would continue for 3 or 4 months thereafter. During this period, Lono ruled the Aina as supreme akua over all, replacing Ku, the war akua, who ruled the Aina for the other 8 months of the year. During Lono's reign, war, human sacrifice, and labor were kapu. It was a time of rejoicing, leisure, hula dancing, and sports. As the akua Lono made his clockwise circuit around an island, the Maka'ainana would bring forth their ho'okupu, tribute, to the konohiki and Ali'i Nui in honor of Lono. The Ali'i Nui would feed Lono in the Hanai Pu, feeding together ceremony, after which the festival games and dancing would begin. The celebration rejoiced in the fertility that the male akua Lono bestowed upon the divine female, the Aina, by his presence. The very term ho'okupu, defined in English as tribute, actually means to make something grow. In this case, it is the mana, the divine power of the akua, which is made to grow, so that he in turn can make life grow in the Aina and in the people. Not only does Lono cause the fertility of the Aina, and by extension the quality of life to increase, but the people by their ho'okupu also cause the mana of Lono to increase. It is a continual cycle of empowerment. At the annual Makahiki festival, each konohiki would collect from his or her maka'ainana the tribute that was to be presented to the konohiki next up in line. This meant that the konohiki would gather tribute from his various kihapai farms and present it to the konohiki of the Pauku Aina, joint of land, who in turn would pass it on to the konohiki of the Mo'oaina, strip of land, and so on to the Ali'i of the Apupua'a and Moku. The final presentation would be to the Mo'i, who would symbolically feed the fruit of the Aina to the Akua Lono. After the collection of these gifts, which included pigs, dogs, tapa, and feathers, the wealth was redistributed predominantly to the many followers of the Ali'i Nui. While little probably filtered down to the Maka'ainana, their benefit, however symbolic, was nonetheless real. Their Aina had been revitalized by the Akua in whose honor they had given tribute. The Aina could now feed them, because it had been touched by the Akua, who was Lono, and who, in another mystical sense, was the Mo'i. In fact, many famous Ali'i Nui have carried variants of the name Lono. These include Lono i ka Makahiki, Lono of the Makahiki Festival, Lono i ka Haupu, Lono in the Recollection, Lono a Pi'ilani, Lono the son of Pi'ilani, Lono a Vohi, Lono of the Vohi Kapu, Lono Ma'ai Kanaka, Lono accustomed to ruling supreme, Lono i kai hopu kaua o Kalani, Lono who seizes the reign of the heavens, and so on. These Lono Ali'i were by the mana of their names Kinolao. representations of Lono on earth. Furthermore, it was required that the mo'i feed the akua with his own hands. In this ritual of hanaipu, the mo'i was Lono's representative, not only collecting the gifts for Lono, but also symbolically feeding them to him. At the same time, it was the mo'i's right to appropriate the tribute to Lono and use it for his own purposes, as he was the representative of the akua, and the ho'okupu helped to make his own mana grow. In practical terms, the maka'inana fed and clothed the ali'i nui, who provided the organization required to produce enough food to sustain an ever-increasing population. Should a maka'inana fail to cultivate or malama his portion of aina, that was grounds for dismissal. By the same token, should a konohiki fail in proper direction of the maka'inana, he too would be dismissed for his own failure to malama. The ali'i nui were no better off in this respect, for if any famine affected the aina, they could be ousted for failing to malama their religious duties. Hence, to malama aina was by extension to care for the maka'inana and the ali'i, for in the Hawaiian metaphor, these three components are mystically one and the same. The following chant illustrates the mystical union of aina ali'i and maka'inana. It was performed at the birthing ceremonies of Kaui Keaoli at Keauhou, Kona, Hawaii in 1813. He was a son of Kamehameha I and ruled as Kamehameha III from 1825 to 1854. In this chant, the island or land represents the foetus developing in the mother's womb. The land that sways and trembles is the mother of the child giving birth, just as the earth mother, Papahana Moku, Papa who gives birth to islands, has done to the island of Hawaii, touched by Wakea, the sky father, perhaps acts as midwife. The island child appears. The land is Hawaii, but is also the child, Kauikeaoli, who is destined to rule Hawaii. The Aina of his birth and the Aina who has metaphorically given birth to him. It is he who established as Ali'i Nui of Hawaii and is sanctified. The island, however, is not only the child. Indeed, it is beneath him, for he is the cloud, as indicated by his name Kauikeauli, placed in the dark cloud, who reigns above and upon the Aina. The moku, because it is beneath the Ali'i Nui, is a symbolic body of the maka'ainana, those who live on the land. Because the Aina is both the Ali'i Nui and the maka'ainana, as well as the elder and the younger siblings, Malama Aina, in traditional times, was truly to care for and serve one another. This metaphor still existed in 1849 when the Ali'i Nui Paki and Konia applied for certain Aina on Kauai, which they said they wanted to continue to Malama. In the lists of Aina compiled in 1850 for a commutation division of Ali'i Aina required by the government, the Ali'i, including Kamamalu, Kapuaiva, Ke'elikolani, Kekunau'a, Kapa'akea, Kana'ina, Lunalilo, Ka'eo, and Kanoa, all stated that they would malama the Aina they kept, while giving away ha'aviaku, the rest, to the government. In the English text, it says that the chiefs wanted to retain certain lands, not preserve or care for them, as the word malama actually means. In English and from the Western viewpoint, it might appear that the Ali'i were greedy and merely sought to claim such Aina in private ownership. The use of the word malama, however, indicates that the traditional metaphoric category for this term was still operational, if perhaps somewhat violated by the encroaching foreign system of capitalism. It was the Ali'i Nui duty to malama Aina, and in the Hawaiian way of thinking, this was not a lunu, greedy behavior. It was pono. This is not to say that the metaphor of malama was not affected by the foreign notion of buying and selling Aina. Certainly it was, since in Hawaiian terms this was equivalent to buying and selling one's elder sister. Buying and selling Aina, created by the Akua, was even like selling one's grandmother, as Papahanaumoku was a grandfather to the Hawaiian race. It was most inappropriate behavior, particularly for an Ali'i Nui, and yet the Ali'i Nui were increasingly pressured into such behavior by foreigners for fear of losing control of all the Aina in the event of an overthrow of the Hawaiian government by some foreign power. However, no matter how corrupting and powerful the capitalist pressures for the private ownership of Aina might have been, the concept of malama endured and still endures in modern times. The evidence for this is the Mo'i Kauikeaoli's declaration of 1847, wherein he claimed to be the konohiki of all the Aina. This very significant statement did not mean that he was the low-level overseer of cultivation of the kihapai. It signified instead his konohiki duty to Malama to care for all the Aina in his kingdom on behalf of his people. In this sense, konohiki is a term synonymous with Malama, but only with regard to Aina. Malama Aina is then the first lesson of Wakea. Aikapu, the separation of male and female, Ali'i and Maka'ainana. The second lesson of Wakea is the importance of the Aikapu as a religion and a central metaphor of separation around which traditional Hawaiian society was organized. On the most elementary level, Aikapu is that which prevents the unclean nature of women from defiling male sanctity when they offer sacrifice to the male akua, and which is further observed on the kapu nights of the 4 major male akua. The foods forbidden to women, pig, coconut, banana, and certain red fish, were not only phallic symbols, but also kinolau, one of the many physical forms of the major male akua. The pig is a kinolau of the fertility, akua lona, and is certainly a male symbol because its practice of rooting in an inherently female earth is a common Hawaiian sexual metaphor. At the heiau, or temple, too, a pig is a substitute for a man. The coconut, on the other hand, is said to be a man whose head is planted in the ground, while his penis and testicles dangle above. The coconut tree is also a mystical body of the war, akua ku. The banana, a kinolau of Kanaloa, akua of the ocean, has a large purple flower that droops toward the ground in a classically phallic fashion, and the fruit itself has a phallic shape. The banana trunk was also used in spear-throwing practice to symbolize a man. Certain fish, usually those red in color, and also aku, bonito, were kapu to women because they were used in sacrifices to the akua. Red fish also represented the fishing akua, ku'ula, ku of the red color. For women, to eat these foods would not only allow their mana to defile the sacrifice to the male akua, but would also encourage them to devour male sexual prowess. The latter would include the sexual prowess of the akua lono, akua of fertility and agriculture, ku, akua of war and wood carving, kanaloa, akua of the ocean and ocean travel, and ku'ula, akua of deep-sea fishing. Given that the word ai means to eat, to devour, and also to rule and to control, if women ate the kinolau of these akua, they would gain the mana to rule the domains represented by these akua. Women could then rule male sexual prowess, including war, agriculture, ocean travel, and deep-sea fishing. What would be left for men to do? The women in traditional Hawaiian literature are incredibly strong and powerful. They give birth to the aina, akua, and ali'i. For example, Papa, Pele, La'i, and Haumea. Give wisdom to men. For example, Hina, Kama'uina Nea, and Uli. Revive men from the dead. For example, Hi'iaka and Lainihi. And destroy men when angry. For example, Pele and Kalamainu'u. Perhaps the Aikapu was much more than a ruse played on Papa by her errant Kane, man or husband, Wakea. On another level, it may have been the only way that Hawaiian men could emerge from under the control of the internal source of mana, the Hawaiian female. Notice that the word haumia, defiling, is very close to the name haumea, the ancient akua wahine of childbirth, source of all life. She was a sister of the akua kane and kanaloa, who arrived very early in Hawaii, and her name is often interchanged with Papahanaumoku, the Earth Mother. In Oahu traditions, she is an akua prayed to under the name Kameha'ikana for war and political control and for abundance of fish in the fish ponds. She saves her kane wakea from being offered in sacrifice to Ku and leads her people in battle to defeat her husband's rival, the male ali'i nui, Kumuhonua. On the other hand, the term la'a, sacred, is also the name of an Oahu ali'i who had sojourned in Tahiti and brought back with him new traditions and new technology. La'amaikahiki established a new lineage of ali'i in Haumea's homeland at Kualoa, Oahu, around AD 1200. Might he have also brought the new custom of Aikapu along with his new akua? Did a new tradition of male sanctity supplant the older one of Haumea wherein females were superior? Perhaps. However, the tradition related to us by the male writers Malo and Kamako reveals that Papa agreed to the Aikapu, even though it apportioned to her husband's sanctity and made her a defiling influence when dealing with the male Kua. As Westerners have pointed to the Aikapu as proof of the inferior role of women in traditional Hawaiian society, we should perhaps examine the practical aspects of this law. What would Papa, the creator of islands, have to gain from giving such power to her husband? We can only speculate on what actually happened, but we might first consider what is known. Because women could defile a sacrifice to the male Kua, and because food was a sacrifice to those same male Kua, men had to do all the cooking. Men had to build 2 separate eating houses and prepare 2 separate food ovens. Moreover, when a human sacrifice was required for the heiau, women could not be killed because they were a defiling influence. Only men were sacrificed to the male Kua. Finally, the foods forbidden to women did not present any physical hardship, as there was plentiful protein, fish, chicken, and dog, and carbohydrate, taro, sweet potato, and breadfruit in other forms. Nor did the Haumea nature of women make them inferior to men. Rather, it made them dangerous and thus powerful. Their Haumea applied only to situations where sacrifice to the male Akua was required and not to all other aspects of life. For example, if a woman, especially in an ali'i nui, were angry with her kane, she could deny him divine favor from the male Akua by defiling his sacrifice. Technically, a male ali'i nui should kill a woman for such an action, but few would ever contemplate destroying the source of their mana, as the next generation of ali'i nui came from such women. On the other hand, few ali'i nui women would forsake their kane, who are also their brothers, in such a fashion, for that would invite defeat from another family of ali'i nui. As a Hawaiian woman, I can frankly say that I would not mind if I had never ate with a man. I can think of many more interesting things to do with men than to eat with them. And if it meant that men would do all the cooking and that only men would be offered in sacrifice, I would, like my ancestral grandmother Papa, agree to this law. I do not find the Aikapu demeaning. Instead, it seems likely to me that under this religion, men in traditional Hawaii worked harder than men do in modern Western society. Perhaps Papa felt as I do and decided that eating without men and foregoing certain foods was well worth the exchange of men doing their share of work. The metaphor of Aikapu, however, is much more than the separation of male kapu from the desecration of female essence. It is the underpinning of the entire kapu system. It exemplifies the role of the kahuna in separating the divine ali'i nui from the defiling influence of the maka'ainano by means of the rigid personal kapu, which arose in conjunction with the Aikapu. Thus, while the Aina, ali'i nui, and maka'ainana are, by the genealogies, mystically unified, they are also in the practical reality of things quite distinctly set apart. In a world where everyone cannot be both a kua and field laborer, such separation is essential for the ordering of society. It was the ali'i nui who had to follow the dictates of the Aikapu most closely, because they were the akua on earth, who mediated between ordinary humans and the destructive, reproductive forces of the unseen divinities of the cosmos. In order for the mo'i to be pono, that is, a righteous mo'i, who could ensure the well-being of the people, he or she must carefully uphold the Aikapu. The people admired a religious chief. Should a new mo'i decide not to reinstate the Aikapu, it was predicted such a mo'i would soon lose the kingdom, along with his or her life. How does one make an akua on earth? Wakea's kahuna reveals the way. Create a great distance between the maka'ainana who labors and the ali'i nui who rules. For the ali'i nui to be an akua, he must have the power of an akua. that is, absolute power over life and death. The alii nui must be perceived to be as dangerous as the unseen akua. Therefore, to the extent that divine forces are unpredictable and sometimes fatal, so too must be the alii nui. It was the system of strict kapu surrounding the alii nui that threatened certain death and established the fear that transformed into reverence. Thus, in Hawaii, the personal kapu of the alii nui meant that the slightest infraction was death for the transgressor. Should the shadow of a maka'inana fall upon an alii nui, death followed. Should a maka'inana stand above an alii nui, it was death. Should he wear the malo loincloth of the alii nui, it was death. Should he refuse to prostrate himself before the alii nui, it was death. Should he trespass the boundaries surrounding an alii nui's household, it was death. A maka'inana near an alii nui was constantly surrounded by the threat of death, as all maka'inana knew that death was the penalty for such infractions. They kept their distance from the alii nui. In normal practice, probably very few maka'inana were killed for breaking an alii nui kapu, because the very threat of these sanctions was enough to preclude such behavior. Hence, the successive hierarchy of kauko'ali'i, lesser chiefs, served as a buffer between the common laborer and the godlike alii nui. Most of the interaction between maka'inana and alii took the form of the farmer or fisherman working in consultation with the konohiki, who were of the kauko'ali'i class. The konohiki were the ones who came into actual contact with the alii nui and were exposed to the dangers of the court. Since the konohiki were of some alii descent and were raised in alii nui households, they were well trained in proper etiquette, although that is not to say they might not make an inadvertent error, exposing themselves to a fatal result. John Papa'i'i, as a young retainer in Lihulihu's court, once dropped the cover of the royal spittoon on his knee, but he caught it before it touched the ground. Had his hand not been so quick, death would have followed. This mixture of reverence for akua and severe religious sanction was prevalent throughout Polynesia. Polynesians love their gods because they are dangerous. Their very danger makes them powerful and worthy of worship. The gods who mete out death can also give life. So it was with the Hawaiians, who loved their akua because they feared them. This is how the separation between alii nui and maka'inana was accomplished. The alii nui became fearful akua, and the maka'inana, in their reverence, avoided direct contact with them. This distinction was furthered by the establishment of state rituals, maintained by the alii nui, that were performed separately from the rituals of the commoner. The maka'inana had their aumakua, or divine family guardians, as well as the akua pertinent to their various trades, whom they worshipped individually with simple rituals. The alii nui, on the other hand, held elaborate ceremonies at the heiau at various times during the lunar month to honor the 4 major male akua, and also twice each year to honor the akua lono with the maka'iki, the akua ku with the aha. The aha rituals were very strict, requiring from the audience total silence and absence of movement for hours on end. During this time, the mo'i and kahuna nui offered prayers to the akua, and nothing could be followed to interfere. Should anyone on the heiau make a sound or move, the prayer would be broken and death would follow for the offender. Should the kahuna nui or mo'i falter in the least in the pronouncement of a prayer, the extensive rituals would have to begin all over again. In this aha ceremony, by which the mo'i petitioned the war akua ku to save his aha from sickness and death, and most of all from rebellion, the kahuna nui had a most interesting role. At various points in the ritual, the kahuna nui would question the mo'i as to whether all the requirements for the aha had been met. It was only when the mo'i responded affirmatively that the Kahuna Nui would finally affirm the validity of the aha. The aha was good, and you, your land, the chiefs, and all the people shall live. When the people heard the news, the shouting resounded everywhere. The voices of the warriors and the commoner rumbled. The celebrated news spread to all the surrounding areas, and the mind of the chief and the priest and the chiefs and all the people were comforted. The shouting at the culmination of the ceremony was, in fact, a public proclamation that the great Akua Ku had approved of the particular Mo'i and would support him in the face of any rebellion during the following year. Ali'i Nui received their political power from Ku. Therefore, an Ali'i must be religious and proclaim the Aikapu upon his ascent to the office of Mo'i. If he did not, his people would reject him as irreligious, and other Ali'i Nui would be tempted to usurp his position. Moreover, the Akua's approval could not be procured without the Kahuna Nui's agreement. Thus, a Mo'i could not rule for long without the blessing of his Kahuna Nui, for this blessing reassured the people that the Akua were pleased with their earthly representative. In this way, the Mo'i was made pono. He was both religiously and politically fit to rule. Hence, the traditional religion known as the Aikapu supported and edified every aspect of the political structure and further defined the relationship between Ali'i and Maka'inana. The entire society could only function properly when the Aikapu restriction on men and women eating together was strictly observed by the Ali'i Nui. The personal couple of the Ali'i Nui were maintained to preserve the distance between Ali'i Nui and Maka'inana, and the Kahuna agreed that the Mo'i was pono. In historical times, the Aikapu endowed the Ali'i Nui with the mana necessary to confront foreigners on an equal basis. Beginning with Cook's visit in 1778, the Hawaiian sense of pono, which was ensured by strict adherence to the Aikapu, was under continual attack by foreigners. Westerners ridiculed Hawaiian religious beliefs as mere superstition and, by extension, denigrated the whole of Hawaiian society. The Ali'i Nui, however, did not consider such odd Western opinions too seriously, so long as they themselves remained steadfast in the Aikapu. The following account of a religious debate between Kamehameha and Captain George Vancouver is illustrative of the tussle for mana between native and foreigner when Hawaiian pono was intact. In 1793, Vancouver attempted to convert the Mo'i to Christianity, urging him to abandon Hawaiian Akua. When Vancouver expounded on the mana of Jehovah, the one true God, Kamehameha proposed a clever experiment. He suggested that Vancouver's priest and one of his kahuna ascend a steep cliff near Kealakekua on Hawaii Island and leap off. The survivor would prove, by his continued existence, the greater capacity for mana and the pono of his akua. When Vancouver declined to participate in this test, his lack of faith left and amused Kamehameha unimpressed with his theological arguments. Thus, Kamehameha confounded that audacious habit of foreigners who feel impelled to foist their customs and religion upon others. In any event, Kamehameha knew that he would have won the contest, as lelepali, cliff leaping, was an ancient sport among the Hawaiian ali'i, and kahuna were from the ali'i class. Kamehameha was secure in his dealings with foreigners because he knew that his pono and political power came from the Aikapu religion. For Malo tells us, from the earliest times down to the time of Kamehameha I, not one of the kings who had subjugated under his rule an entire island has been irreligious. Every one of them has worshipped the gods with faith and sincerity. If the services of religion under any king were conducted in a slack or slovenly manner, it would be the general opinion that government would pass into the hands of a king under whom the services of religion would be strictly and correctly performed. Ni'opi'o mating, the metaphor of incest. The third lesson of the Epic of Wakea is that incest is acceptable, even desirable. The brother-sister incest of Wakea and Papa captures the mana of the sacred female earth and creates the universe. The father-daughter incest of Wakea and Ho'ohoku Kalani transforms the akua into a wondrous food, Haloanaka, the kalo plant, the life source of Kalahui, Hawaii. Through incest, the first Ali'inui Haloa was born, and because Ali'inui are akua, incest is by definition a formula of creating divinity. And as Wakea and Papa are akua, incest is then an akua-like attribute. How do Ali'inui gain and maintain divine status? By behaving like akua, no doubt. Hence, incest is not only for producing divinity, but the very act of incest is proof of divinity. No wonder the Ali'inui guarded incest so jealously and refused to allow the Kauko Ali'i and Maka'inana that privilege. For Kauko Ali'i or Maka'inana to mate with his sister would be a direct challenge to the Ali'inui's authority. Thus, to Hawaiians, the offspring of Ni'opi'o, brother-sister mating, was in akua. If one was truly the mo'i, one should seek a Ni'opi'o relationship, as did the mo'i Kauikeaoli with his sister Nahi'enaena in the 1830s, despite the Calvinist missionaries' abject horror. For him, the only mating that would ensure his divinity and proclaim his right to be the highest Ali'inui of the Aina was Ni'opi'o mating. Other incestuous matings, such as that of an Ali'inui with his half-sister or with his brother's daughter, could also produce an akua or divine offspring. Uncle-niece and aunt-nephew matings were desirable too, for in bridging the generational gap. One imitated the original pattern of Wakea. The familial terminology of traditional Hawaii influenced this metaphor as well. Makuakane and makuahine denote father and mother, but they also mean uncle and aunt, and can be used when referring to any member of one's parents' generation. By extension, any child can be called one's keiki, child, whether son, daughter, nephew, niece, or hanai, adopted child. This means that an uncle-niece mating was in the same classification as that of a father-daughter mating. Wakea is recalled again. The search for Wakea's mana, the divine or miraculous power which fathered islands, kalo, and chiefs, led the Ali'inui to carefully consider genealogical lines. This was particularly true when arranging the initial mating of a high female Ali'inui, because it was the most appropriate to mate her with a closely related Ali'inui, so that they would together create a child of the highest rank, an akua. Any means of ascending the genealogy by either the mother's or the father's side was acceptable so long as the desired result was produced. A historical example of this genealogical reckoning was demonstrated by the informal mating of Kamehameha with Keopuolani. She was a very high female Ali'inui in her own right, being a granddaughter of Kalani'opu'u, mo'i of Hawaii Island, on the one side, and a great-granddaughter of Kekaulike, mo'i of Maui, on the other. Her grandmother was Kalola, daughter of Kekaulike and sister of Kaikili, a Maui mo'i who in the time of Kamehameha ruled from Maui to Ni'iho. Furthermore, Kalola was not only the mother of Keopuolani's father, Kivala'o, by Kalani'opu'u, but she was also the mother of Keopuolani's mother, Keku'iapoiwa, Liliha. By Kalani Kupuapai Kalani Keowa, the half-brother of Kalaniʻopuʻu. Thus, Keopuolani's father and mother were half-brother and half-sister by means of two half-brothers mating with the same woman. She was thereby a Ni'aupio chiefess. Clearly, Keopuolani was an Okua. Yet her children by Kamehameha were raised to an even higher status because Kamehameha and her mother, Kekuiapoiwa Liliha, had the same father, Kalani Kupuapai Kalani Keowa. Kamehameha by that reckoning was her uncle, or in Hawaiian terms, her father, and the children of their Ni'aupio mating were the highest Akua of the kingdom. Thus he referred to her as his daughter, and to their children Liho Liho, Kauikeaoli, and Nahi Ena Ena as his grandchildren. Because their mating followed this example of Wakea and Ho'ohoku Kalani, it was higher than any mating Kamehameha might have had with his sisters. When the progeny was of a higher rank than the parents, the whole lineage was uplifted. Just as the child was a reflection of the parents' genealogy and gained identity from their glory, so too did the ancestor gain mana through the divinity of the child. Just as genealogical reckoning was an important argument for the right to supreme political power, there was also a genealogical imperative for the Ali'i Nui to procreate. While Kamehameha was of a good lineage and was the conquering mo'i, his lineage was further glorified and secured by his producing sacred heirs through his mating with Keopuolani. His divine offspring proved him a favorite of the unseen Akua. A high female ali'i nui, after her carefully maneuvered first mating, was usually free to take any ali'i nui as her lover, and the higher her lineage, the greater would be the demand for matings with her. Often she might live with two ali'i nui at the same time or in close succession, and as a result, her child would be considered po'olua, two heads. Po'olua refers to the Hawaiian belief that both ali'i nui would be the child's father. Po'olua, in genealogical reckoning, raised the child's mana because he or she could claim illustrious ancestors from three sides, that of two fathers and one mother. Kalaniʻopuʻu, the mo'i of Hawaii Island, at the time of Cook, was po'olua because her mother, Kamakaʻimoku, lived in close succession with Peleoholani, mo'i of Oahu, and with Kalani Nui, ia Mamau, an ali'i nui of Hawaii. In fact, the name Kalaniʻopuʻu refers to the opu'u flowerbud style of carved whale's tooth necklace that was prevalent to Oahu and worn by Peleoholani. Besides po'olua, another type of relationship arose from the custom of multiple mating. This was punalua, literally two springs, which referred to two lovers who shared one mate, either at the same time or one after the other. The situation might be two men sharing one woman, as with Kalaniʻopuʻu's parents, or it might be two women sharing one man. Thus, Ka'ahumanu and her sister Kahehemalie were punalua to one another because they shared their husband, Kamehameha. Punalua was not only practiced by the ali'i nui but also by the maka'ainana. Punalua required that the partners of the same sex put jealousy aside and care for one another's children as their own. While a certain amount of jealousy was inescapable, nonetheless, envy between lovers was considered very bad form and subject to derision. Children from such a mating were often taken in hanai by one's punalua and treated with every affection. It was by punalua right that Ka'ahumanu claimed Liho Liho as her hanai son, since she shared Kamehameha with Keopuolani, mother of Liholiho, and this made them Punalua to one another. Because of the laws of Punalua, wives and heirs of the Mo'i could live in harmony with one another, at least until the Mo'i died and successors struggled for supremacy. Despite all the intertwining of lineages and the producing of new Akua, or divine Ali'i Nui, there was little room at the top since there could be only one Mo'i for each island. If the heir to the Mo'i was not politically astute enough to strongly impose his will upon the death of the old Mo'i, war usually ensued. The Ali'i Nui in that instance could either challenge the new Mo'i in war, hoping for victory rather than defeat, or they could choose to serve him in some capacity. The first alternative might bring death, and the second would most often mean a loss of personal mana. As for Ali'i of lesser lineages, their path was to choose an Ali'i Nui to follow and hope that he or she would lead them to victory. In any case, their lot would also be to serve the Ali'i Nui, and their mana would only be increased by some great deed in battle or by attracting the eye of some female Ali'i Nui for a sufficient time to produce a child by her. Imihaku, searching for the two paths to mana of Ku and Lono. Hawaiian society, being dualistic in nature, developed over time a delicate balance between the Akua, Ku, and Lono. Ku, an Akua of war and political power that proceeded from warfare, possessed the Aina for 8 months of the year. In more elaborate terms, he was known as Ku Kailimoku, Ku, the island conqueror, Ku Ho'one'e Nu'u, Ku, the mover of great heights, and Ku Waha Ilo, Ka, of the maggot-filled mouth, because of the human sacrifices he devoured. The Ali'i Nui gained political power through human sacrifices to Ku, terrifying their enemies, just as this Akua terrified his human subjects. Ku's antithesis was Lono, an Akua of Kahiki, probably Tahiti, but also meaning foreign lands, who came to Hawaii annually, bringing fertility and peace to the Aina. In the 4 months that Lono was in possession of the Aina, war and hard labor were kapu. After an initial ho'okupu tribute to Lono, peace, feasting, games, and hula ensued. Human life was never given to Lono. His was the sacrifice of pigs, foodstuffs, kapa cloth, and feathers, that is, of material wealth. Lono, in that sense, was an Akua of material wealth, while Ku was the means to achieve such wealth. Lono revitalized the Aina after Ku had devastated it through warfare. The Ali'i Nui, as intermediaries for the Akua, accepted the ho'okupu from the maka'inana in the name of Lono and performed the hanaipu, the ritual of feeding Lono. Ali'i Nui, who during most of the year received their political power from Ku, had to placate Lono at this time, lest he forsake Hawaii, returning to Kahiki forever. Therefore, if famine struck, clearly the Mo'i was at fault for offending Lono. Conversely, when an Ali'i Nui lost a war, it was thought that a ritual had been neglected, and the favor of Ku had passed to the rival Ali'i. In this event, the Maka'inana and Kaukau Ali'i would transfer their loyalty to the Ali'i Nui who had won Ku's approbation to become the new Mo'i. Such a search for a new source of mana was called imihaku, to search for a lord. In most instances, when there was a change of Ali'i Nui, the Maka'inana would not be dispossessed of the Aina upon which they lived and worked. Regardless of the Mo'i, only the Konohiki would change because the new Ali'i Nui would bring in his own people. In this light, loyalty to a deposed Ali'i Nui was unwise, if not nonsensical. It was no easy task to be mo'i in traditional Hawaii. The Hawaiian system of hierarchy is somewhat triangular in concept. On each main island, a single mo'i at the apex of the society served as an intermediary between the akua and the rest of Kalahui. Several levels of subordinate Ali'i Nui and Kahuna Nui were followed by more numerous and lesser-ranking Ali'i and Kahuna who acted as Konoiki. These people created a buffer between the mo'i and the vast majority of maka'ainana who made up the foundation of the society. Those at the top were kapu, or sacred, and possessed of mana. Those at the bottom were noa, common or free from kapu, and by extension, without the necessary mana or power to invoke a kapu, although even a common fisherman, if successful, had some mana. Those in between were on a sliding scale. Having less mana, the further down the triangle they slipped, and the farther away they fell from high lineage. These differentiations in status were designed by birth. There tended to be, however, a constant downward shift away from kapu because Ali'i Nui found it difficult to mate only with high female Ali'i Nui. Those intermarrying with Ali'i of lesser rank produced Kauko Ali'i who, in turn, could descend with the same facility to maka'ainana rank. The object, then, was to elevate one's mana in the eyes of the people and escape the pit of commonality. This was another symbolic imihaku, to search for a source of mana. There were two ways mana could be obtained, through sexual means and through violence. To mate with an Ali'i Nui Wahine, or a woman of high rank, was to capture the fertility of the akua. Of course, to Malama'aina was also to secure the fertility of the akua. This was the path of Lono. However, if a male was of low rank, perhaps a Kaukau Ali'i, or even a Maka'ainana, and not closely related to an Ali'i Nui Wahine, he would somehow have to attract her attention. If he were skilled at sports or better still, gifted in hula and chant, he could be brought to court to entertain the Ali'i Nui, and perhaps gain an introduction. Alternatively, if a man were handsome and somewhat talented in dance and poetry, he could be kept as an aikane, or male lover of an Ali'i Nui, as they were often bisexual. After living at court for a time, he might get lucky and be taken as a lover by an Ali'i Wahine. Lono was the patron of the arts that celebrated human sexuality, and these were included in his path to mana. The alternative road to mana was violence, in the form of warfare, which was the path of ku. According to Kamako, the main occupation of Ali'i Nui and Kauko Ali'i was war and the conquest of other Ali'i Nui and their territory. Hawaiian Ali'i Nui had a great passion for war because it was a major avenue to mana. Those victorious in war sacrificed the defeated upon the altar of ku, thereby collecting his mana. The defeated were eventually forgotten, while the victors were made glorious and famous in song and legend. To be terrifying and ruthless ensured success and a prominent place in traditional Hawaiian history. This path to mana was chosen by Kahekili Nui Ahumanu of Maui. He was of identical lineage to his elder brother Kamehameha Nui, who ruled peacefully for 29 years and had many heirs. Yet the lineage of Kamehameha Nui did not retain power. Instead, the descendants of Kahekili prevailed. Kahekili was a ferocious warrior who had one side of his body tattooed from head to toe, recalling the lightning bolt, once his name Kahekili, in honor of Kanehekili, the Maui Oahu Akua of lightning. Courting danger was his pleasure. Through ruthless cunning and manipulation of relatives, Kahekili gained control over all the islands except Hawaii. To gain Oahu, he treacherously murdered Kahahana, who had been a favorite nephew. When the Oahu chiefs bungled a rebellion against him, he had them all slain in a single day, and their bodies are said to have choked the streams from Kona to Ewa, districts of South Oahu. Through these acts, he increased his mana and status as an akua, and his name is honored in song and legend today. The peaceful Kamehameha Nui, on the other hand, is relatively unknown, and the names of the defeated Oahu Ali'i Nui have for the most part been forgotten. Hence, the intermittent warfare observed by Westerners was in part a product of the Ali'i Nui search for immortality or fame, as well as their unceasing quest for mana. In times of prolonged peace, it was too easy for Ali'i, especially Kauko Ali'i, to slip down into the pit of commonality, becoming farmers and fishermen. And Ali'i's function was to make war. And there were many instances where the mo'i, or an Ali'i Nui, would take his Kauko Ali'i warriors on a raid simply because they were restless at home, and such restlessness could lead to internal treachery and rebellion. For a mo'i to fail on either path to mana was to prove himself outside the state of pono. When a pono mo'i was religiously devoted to the akua, the whole society was pono and prospered. When disaster struck, either through defeat in war or by a famine on the aina, these were signs that the mo'i had ceased to be religious, for the society was no longer pono. In such instances, the mo'i would be killed and replaced by another Ali'i Nui. Hence, a wise mo'i gave close attention to his advisors. In this manner, traditional Hawaiian society, with its diverse and intricate metaphors, functioned extremely well for centuries in splendid isolation. Upon Western contact, a flood of change and physical destruction of Kalahui, Hawaii, made for an inevitable transformation of these metaphors and, by extension, for a new interpretation of the Hawaiian model. However, certain behavioral patterns of traditional times are repeated today. Malama Aina, cherishing the land, is a foundation of the present movement to halt the U.S. military's bombing of Kaho'olawe Island. Aikapu, the metaphor of separation of the sexes of Ali'i and Maka'ainana, underlies the modern Maka'ainana belief that everyone has their proper place in society. Politics and debate should be left to those high makamakas, the Ali'i Nui of today, while Maka'ainana go about their daily business of earning a living and celebrating life. Maka'ainana also expect that so long as they obey the rules and humbly follow the powers that be, then the politicians and the state will intervene on their behalf to ho'omalu and hanai them. Ni'opi'o mating, the metaphor of incest, has been made illegal by Western law and impractical by tainted foreign genes. Yet the idea of ohana, familial relations, and the mana of genealogy, which links us as Lahui Hawaii to our ancestors, to the Aina, and to the beginning of time, is present at every Hawaiian gathering. As for the dual paths to mana, that of Ku and Lono, only Lono has prevailed with strength among the Hawaiian people. Modern Hawaiians celebrate life through sports, hula, and sexuality. Hawaiian youth devote themselves to preparation for the many hula festivals and canoe races. They dedicate innumerable unpaid hours of sweat and aching muscles to the perfection of these ancestral arts. And we Hawaiians continue to make the Aina fertile through our tender care of it, assuming that we are able to wrest some part of the Aina from foreign control. The path of Ku has eluded us. Later, I will examine the source of his demise, for the story of Aina in Hawaii is closely tied to the arts of war and politics. Nor will Hawaiian society ever be pono again until we Hawaiian people come to know our history intimately, and until we can understand the challenges faced by the mo'i Kauikeaoli who made the 1848 mahele. The most important question of Kauikeaoli's life was how he would become a pono mo'i, what would give him the mana to rule. Should he, unlike his father, take the foreigners' advice and live as they did? Or should he find a Hawaiian solution to the problems of the kingdom? In the 1830s, he became an ali'i in a constant state of imihaku. He was in search of the mana that protects and empowers. Because Aina was the most important basis of sovereignty for the Hawaiian ali'i. Kauikeaoli's decisions on control and disposition of the Aina were crucial. Ultimately, proper control of the Aina to benefit Kalahui could designate the mo'i as pono. We must weigh Kauikeaoli's decision about the Aina in light of his capacity to malama Aina. It had been the first lesson of Wakia, and perhaps it needed to be learned again.